Good afternoon. Welcome to the next session of the day. I hope you're all having a great Thursday morning and have had a good Payments Canada Summit so far. I feel very grateful that this is my third year speaking here and always enjoy the content every year, and we hope to continue that with our session right now. My name is Jennifer Tramontana, and I'm going to be your moderator for our session, riding the existing rails. Prepaid platforms gain market share one swipe at a time. But before I introduce our other panelists, just a couple of housekeeping items for you today. So first of all, we welcome your questions. We would love for you to pepper us with questions throughout so that we can have a tremendous organic conversation today and engage with all the topics that you're most interested in. So please use the Ask the Speaker function to ask us a question. If you want to just chat with your fellow attendees, you can do the Join the Conversation function, which is right underneath. During our session, your mic and video will be disabled, so this will be the only way that you'll be able to interact with us. So without further ado, let's get started. And I'd love for each of our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves. So let's start with Kevin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Kevin Ohlson, work for Galileo Financial Technologies. I'm head of strategic international expansion efforts. I've been in card processing and banking for the last 25 years and worked for GE Corporate Card and American Express, and I've done my own program management, supporting efforts that you yourselves might be doing. I'm happy to be here and hope to have a great session with you.
Thanks, Kevin. Jan, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Jan Wolf. I'm Senior Director Commerce Strategy for Blackhawk Network. We're a first global branded payments company and of course distribute and issue prepaid. And my role within Blackhawk is to lead the payment strategy for our global commerce business. So a lot of that actually has to do with sort of reusing existing rails to enable alternative payments, particularly in store.
Thanks, Jan. And Giles.
Perfect. Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. So I am Gilles, or Giles Eubags. Choose your pick as to depends how comfortable you are with your French. So I'm a strategic advisor with a company called IT Noverica Group. So what that means is I am a market research analyst. I am specialized in the commercial banking and payment space, and I'm based here in Toronto, so I do a lot of research within Canada. But I also do a lot of work with my colleagues on the retail banking team within IT, where we do a lot of work looking at prepaid in particular. So it's great to be here today. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks. And then, as I said at the beginning, I'm Jennifer Tramontana, and I am the president of the Fletcher Group. We are an agency that serves payments and fintech companies with branding and marketing and public relations programs. And I'm also very honored to serve as the executive director of the Canadian Prepaid Providers Organization, or CPPO. And we are the trade association that represents the prepaid industry in Canada that you are obviously interested in, and we can't wait to tell you more about, because it is growing tremendously. The prepaid industry in Canada has grown about 80% since 2019. We're approximately an $8.8 billion industry in Canada, and is for the first time growing faster than the United States prepaid industry is. So we're going to walk through a couple of slides for everybody. I hope you all don't mind this, but Giles and his team have put together some very recent research, which we think is really relevant to kind of anchor our conversation today. And I also wanted to give you a sense for what's really happening in the Canadian market. So all of these companies that you see here represent members of my organization, the CPPO. It's not every company that's in prepaid, but it's a large cross-section of them. And as you can see here, it's really across the value chain. Financial institutions, large and small, program managers, processors on the issuing and the acquiring side, program managers, fintechs, third-party service providers, et cetera. So the industry is incredibly rich and varied within Canada. And prepaid has been, growing within the Canadian ecosystem, payments ecosystem for a while. But where it's really taken off, obviously, is over the last 2 years through the pandemic. Whereas approximately 43% of Canadians now say that they're going to pay with different, means and methods, particularly digital and contactless, and they're going to stick with that long term. We've really seen how that has benefited prepaid and why it is becoming so popular. So a couple of the areas that you may not be aware, but prepaid's rails are really driving access to the digital economy in these four sort of main areas. So the rise in BNPL providers, buy now, pay later, is actually mainly due to the accessibility of the prepaid card rails. Gig workers, whether it's prepaid to support actually paying gig workers or being able to actually take payments on the gig platforms, prepaid is behind that as well. On-demand delivery like Instacart, prepaid's providing that access to those digital first platforms for on-demand delivery. And really growth in SMBs with payout and payment innovation. So instant issuance for commercial cards, expense management, accounts payables, etc. It's also enabling the entry of non-banks. You may be used to seeing, a number of these companies. It's really allowing banking to be added to banking services to be added to their customers as an alternative to credit, and really that step before getting a bank license. Prepaid's also connecting consumers in interesting ways with loyalty programs. So linking retailers with like a traditional financial player. And a good example is like PC Financial through its programs like PC Optimum, their loyalty program, and then it can be linked to a PC Money account. But we're also seeing this with other companies like Wealthsimple, et cetera. It's also really starting to enable that real-time and early access to early earnings access, so earned wage access that you may be familiar with. We all know that driving worker retention is a super top priority for businesses right now across any industry, but it's not just about winning over those hourly workers with how much you pay, it's also how you pay them. So in Canada, we've seen a lot of solutions ranging from anytime access during the pay cycle, which is like what Ridin and Dayforce is offering, or 2-day early access to payroll, or access right after every shift, which some other companies like Payfair, et cetera, are offering. And then Prepaid's really has been helping Canadians better manage their money, and this has been going on for a while. So I'm sure you're very familiar with many of these prepaid program providers like Mogo, Koho, Wealthsimple's doing it. MyDough is actually from RBC, Stack is another one. These sort of neobanks or challenger banks are allowing Canadian consumers to better budget, avoid overspending, get in the habit of saving money more easily with different kinds of solutions that don't come with the issues of credit card debt or interest payments from bank accounts as well. And this is a fairly rich and deep part of the prepaid industry in Canada. Another area, and sort of the last one I'll touch on here, that is really ripe for growth is leveraging prepaid for government payments. So Canada actually trails behind most other countries of our sort of size and stature and growth of the economy in using this technology for government payouts, but it's starting to change. And in particular, we really saw it during the CERB payment distributions. They were able to be distributed to any account, whether it was a prepaid account or a traditional bank account. It's very important to continue along this path. As I said, Canada is a little bit behind its peer countries in this area. As a good example, in 2019, the government of Canada issued more than 30 million checks to citizens. There were more than 800,000 unclaimed payments with 370 million in outstanding value. So while we think of Canada as being a highly banked population, there are still those that prefer payment on check. And there's still checks that are either being lost in the system, unclaimed, et cetera, and prepaid provides sort of a more efficient and cost-effective method for getting payments from government to citizens. And then I'll turn it over to Giles, who's just going to walk through for you a couple of slides and results from that research that I mentioned at the upfront.
Perfect. Thanks, Jennifer. So really the top line heading here, which I think for anyone listening in, this should really be the big takeaway here. It's the Canadian prepaid market is doing phenomenally well, right? Growth has been very, very high from already healthy levels of growth in 2019 over previous years pre-pandemic, from 2020 onwards, growth just, hit a rocket booster, right? So we reached 7.2 billion by 2020, a big increase over the previous year of 50%. Obviously growth of that level is not sustainable long term. We wish it was, but that's still really quite exceptional circumstances. But what's more interesting is even aside from that, all our forecasts based on trends, based on market research with issuers and what we see from end users out there, we forecast that growth is going to stay pretty high, right? Substantially higher than most other card product platforms out there. So from 2021 to 22, still seeing growth of 18, 20% year on year. reaching 10.2 billion in 2022. That rate of growth pretty much carries on until 2025 to reach 17.2 billion by 2025. That's a big chunk higher than what we saw in 2019 over quite a short period of time. Now, again, most of that I think really speaks to what Jennifer was just discussing, those new use cases, which I know we'll get into in much more detail. But it's just that flexibility of these products. If we can go to the next slide, please. There we go. And interestingly, again here, we see the number of open loop prepaid card accounts also seeing very strong levels of growth, right? Since the pandemic in 2020, 46 million up to 81 million by 2025. That's a very healthy CAGR of 15%. We'll be reaching, perhaps even higher levels beyond that, I think, without too much distance in between. Now, again, I think a lot of this speaks to, the new use cases we're seeing, the new deployments into different areas. But it's an interesting space where that growth, we don't see any signs of a roadblock within the immediate term. Perhaps next slide, please. And then lastly, I think this is perhaps the most telling, right? When you've got a market where overall growth is growing and cards are growing, what's very important to a prepaid issuer is just the fact that the actual balance per card, the amount loaded per card, is also rising, right? Not necessarily as much, because it kind of just speaks to more people getting into the market, more products being out there, but it's still showing a healthy increase in terms of the amount that people are loading onto their cards year on year. Now, of course, it's inflation will have an impact on this, so it's difficult to judge whether these numbers may go even higher depending on what the inflation environment's like. That's one of those when you're doing forecasts today, things get very complicated very quickly. But we do expect to see growth, remain quite robust, even on an individual per card basis over the next few years. Back to you, Jennifer.
Thanks. I just wanted to mention one thing before we close out, and this is last year's Payments Canada report, the Payments Method and Trend report, and you'll see that prepaid was the second highest growth in terms of volume next to online e-transfer. So just another data point of showing how fast prepaid has been growing. All right. Well, thanks so much for letting us kind of set the stage here and give you all a sense for, maybe if you're new to prepaid or haven't looked at it in a couple of years, what does it really look like in the Canadian market? And Kevin, I'd love to sort of start with you and ask you almost kind of your reaction to the slides. Galileo is one of the, longest, most longevity, processors in this space. This market intimately internationally. What does the Canadian market look like to you compared to others? And what are some of the use cases that you're really seeing grow?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. It's really poised. We're seeing more and more come to either looking for program management or they're looking for an issuer processor like a Galileo or a Marqeta. But really where it comes down to is those features and functionalities that they're looking to put in place and have controls, right? Do they need a one-time use card? And what types of controls do you need around that? Someone has asked a question about gift, and we'll get to some of those questions about gift. But prepaid allows that ability to help reduce the risk of overspending, right? You can put the right controls and processes and procedures in place, give a platform for someone to build their UI or UX to have that great experience, and then use an enabler on the back end to provide access to the rails. We're seeing cases, as you mentioned before, with around buy now, pay later, or in corporate. And I think corporate's another area that doesn't get a lot of attention when it comes to controls. I think of the days where a credit card was given and it had an unlimited amount and people could spend. Or nowadays with per diems being set, you can take and put those controls in place that that someone's only given $50 a day, let's say, for their meals, and they know that the hotel is going to be at a certain rate, and their car rental and their hotel, right? You can certainly set those up so you can help control that spend. It doesn't get out of control or someone. And those are the types of use cases that people come and talk to us about and how we can help fulfill that for them.
And do you find those conversations now are really digital first, Kevin?
They really are.
Or only? Is it only or first?
It's kind of digital first. Can I get a virtual card, right? And how can that be displayed? Can I push it to one of the wallets? Can I do an Apple, a Samsung, or a Google? that if I need a physical card, I eventually could do it, right? There's costs that come with doing the physical card, right? It's pennies on the dollar for doing a virtual card for it to be pushed to a virtual wallet versus now a physical card and all that fulfillment that comes with it. Certainly people like to have that tangible in their hand at some point. And I think there's a generational thing there too, where, and those that are maybe in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who are used to having that, they're not quite familiar with the technology and they're a little nervous about using it because it's unfamiliar. They haven't grown up with it. Where the younger generations that are in their teens and early 20s and 30s, right? They've grown up in this and it's what they want to see. They don't want to impact the environment by having a piece of plastic that may not break down over time. And we're seeing if people are asking for plastics from fulfillment providers, they want something that when it's no longer used, it's expired, right? Our cards have an expiration date. It's going to have to be replaced. If that ends up in a landfill or recycling, is it going to be used in a manner that reduces an impact on the environment? Those are things that across the board, and you wouldn't think that that's not just prepaid, that's across the board with cards.
That's so interesting.
If I can jump in here for a second, I think one thing that's worth highlighting, I think that's a very valid point, right? I think there's kind of the ecological factor, that kind of, lowering some of the footprint there. But I wouldn't underestimate there as well in that push to digital, just the impact of the pandemic, right? If suddenly, being in a very remote digital first, I mean, look at us, here we are again on, a Zoom, whatever this platform is, kind of working remotely. And so many offices have had to adapt to this, where, having that digital first ability to instantly issue payment credentials, right? But do that securely, right? Do it with controls in place. That's something that we're seeing, just a ton of employers from corporates through to the smaller SMBs in the mid-market are really pursuing quite aggressively these days. So I think that's, just that changing nature of work, I think plays into it very well.
Yeah. And on top of that too, because that card can be moved almost instantly into a phone, now it's enabled and it's ready. You don't have to wait for that time for it to come through snail mail and be delivered, right? If you have a new employee, right, we talk about all these different areas with gig workers, it can be immediately pushed in their funds at the end of the day. Maybe they're getting paid on a daily wage. They get the card that first day they start, it's loaded to their wallet, they get paid that day, and away they go. And it provides that stickiness and satisfaction that they're looking from the employer, if that's what the employer is providing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's something that I was kind of wondering about as well, Kevin, as you were going through some of the use cases, or Jennifer, in your opening as well, as you were kind of going through some of the innovative applications of prepaid within our environment today. I mean, to what extent is that also part of or a factor of the user experience that these platforms are trying to enable, right? I mean, I'm thinking about buy now, pay later apps, right, where the interaction is generally sort of within the app that I've got downloaded, and I know, okay, well, here in this store, I can use Klarna, for example, to split my purchase into a couple of different installments, and then I'm there, right? I need that card right away. I need to push it to my Apple Pay in order to then actually make that transaction at the point of sale. So to some extent, I mean, having a physical card, it will be a limitation, right, for service providers such as that.
Yeah, and you talk about that, Jan Lucas, with the enablement, right? That how quickly can I move them from the experience without making it cumbersome? And so that's where that UI UX comes in up front, where someone can, fill out a couple pieces of information, click a couple of buttons, and then, they're moving along. And that's what people are really looking for as well, is how quickly can I get somebody, right? They want them to use the card, and it provides that stickiness, and it's a great experience, right? They're looking for that great experience in the process.
Jan, I'd love to go back to you. We have a question here that I think you'd be great to answer. Again, Blackhawk has been in the space in a really long time. You operate in, tons of countries around the world. We've got a question here about the growth of gift cards and how they tie into physical and digital and loyalty. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing at Blackhawk and what you're seeing innovation-wise in this area.
Yeah, so tons of things happening within gift card, certainly within Blackhawk, but also with what partners are approaching us for. So some of the things that we're seeing is gift card distribution, frankly, in sectors that are somewhat new to us. I'm thinking about crypto exchanges, for example, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, we're seeing e-commerce volumes, I think the latest BitPay statistic is that 40% of e-commerce volumes are for gift cards. So I mean, e-commerce volumes with crypto are used to buy gift cards. And so there's that desire to connect, right, this sort of nascent space to the fiat world, and using that as just one more vehicle for these for large exchanges, for example, to do that. The other thing that we're seeing is gift cards almost as part of a payment flow. So I'm thinking about sort of the Honeys, the Ibotas of the world that have a payment solution as well, sort of embedded in their app, and as part of the payment experience, actually push out a sort of closed loop gift card first, and then sort of pay the distribution commission back to the user. So a fair bit of sort of applications with gift cards themselves that normally kind of happens with behind the scenes as well. And the thing that we're working on that probably is more applicable for the US market and not so much the Canadian market is actually using some of those closed loop rails themselves and sort of building an alternative payments network on top of that. So think of, I'll use the crypto exchange as an example, cash deposits at the point of sale into my crypto wallet, or actually even just kind of taking that crypto wallet and making a payment, so similar how you would make a payment with a closed loop gift card at the point of sale. It's just one sort of alternative rail to whatever might be out there.
And that's Jan, that's an interesting case, right, around crypto. Could I liquidate crypto to a prepaid and use it to go on vacation? That way I'm not exposing a bank account or another credit card or whatever. Right? Think back to the days of, and I'm sure they're still available, American Express offers traveler's checks. Why not offer a prepaid card that's used in travel so that if something happens, right, you've got coverage, right? Maybe there's some insurance that comes with it, but now I'm only putting a specific amount on there that may be for meals that we're going to have on vacation, or it's going to, purchase our activities that we're going to go with, but I limit and I'm not exposing my personal accounts or credit cards to that. Or if I've got crypto and I want access to it, rather than tying a card directly to crypto, why not liquidate it to fiat and load it to a card, and now I can go use it. We're seeing more and more of that, where they don't necessarily want to tie the card directly to crypto, but they want to get the fiat to a card that they can use.
This is a legit question. I actually don't know the answer. I'd just be curious to hear from you guys. I don't want to take this too off tangent, but I'm just curious, that jump from crypto to prepaid card, what are the AML and KYC requirements? Because I'd imagine a lot of regulators would be very nervous there. But right, kind of the implication of moving crypto to a prepaid card. And sorry, Jennifer, I know we could easily go off down a deep rabbit hole here. I'm just curious if you guys have any quick thoughts on this.
I know the networks, Visa and MasterCard, are pretty amicable that if it's a one-time load up to a certain amount, they're acceptable with it, that there doesn't have to be a KYC process done. But if you're going to do more than one load, then obviously we've got to go through that process. Yeah. And that's at least from a U.S. market perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There was, I think, a study that CipherTrace conducted the other year that kind of looked at that space too. I mean, the regulatory environment has come so far as well that the players in that space, I mean, they almost split right down the middle, with ones that have pretty stringent sort of KYC AML controls at this point, having to comply with the licensing regimes that exist in a lot of markets today, and the ones that don't, right? And certainly that's a sort of prerequisite for us to work with any of those parties, right? I'll say one more thing just on crypto in particular, just because I had a conversation with some of the large exchanges within the APAC region just yesterday. The interesting sort of perspective that I keep hearing out of that space is that the utility of paying is actually sort of vital to the growth of crypto as a whole. I mean, we're seeing sort of demographics merging. The person that would pick up a prepaid card within the store, sort of merging that next wave of crypto buyers. And that's a utility actually being really important for them to even get invested in that space in the first place. I mean, we hear a lot about hodling and sort of keeping crypto balances and just waiting for it to rise and all of that. But there is still an underlying desire to transact. And I think there was a payments.com study that got published there last year, where that constitutes 2/3 of crypto holders. So definitely sort of a space as well for growth, certainly for this industry, in my view.
Well, and we've seen, I mean, we've certainly seen during the pandemic that, consumers now are so much more aware, right, of these options for banking, transacting, investing, savings, in ways that they weren't necessarily before. It's like an entire new audience has really been woken up to that, overnight over the last 2 years. And there's just more demand, attention, and sort of education around that things could be done differently, right? And there are different, forms out there, form factors, and et cetera. Let's talk a little bit. Let's continue the regulation discussion a little bit here, because we've got a couple questions about it, which is no surprise. And I'll say a couple things to answer these questions, and then I'd love to get the take from others. So, first of all, someone has asked, what measures can governments take to improve the regulatory environment? And the way that we have approached it as CPPO is, of course, we're comfortable with the right-sized regulations for the industry to be able to grow responsibly, right? And that key is always right-sized. Prepaid has always sort of been a victim of unintended consequences in the past, because it is such a sort of nimble, flexible platform to be able to do a lot of things with. In the past, in the United States and even in other countries, there have sometimes been regulations that kind of ensnare the industry when it wasn't, intended or truly necessary. And so what we are really focused on at the CPPO is a couple of things, is appropriate AML regulations. And I see there's another question about that here. There are brand new AML regulations that everyone knows have just come out. If you're interested in learning more about that, I would say two things. Jackie Shinfield at Blake's has put out a blog post on that that will give you all of the details on it. She will also be interviewing Lucien Brazeau from FinTrack at a conference that we're having, CPPO is having on June the 1st, which will just be a one-day thought leadership session on prepaid. You can find that on our website at cppo.ca. If you're interested in attending, it's in person that day, and we're going to have several sessions along with this. So AML is one thing. We also are working on regulatory harmonization in the provinces. So as you saw from the presentation I gave and everything that we're talking about here, prepaid is, for all intents and purposes, some sort of a bank account and transacting alternative now, right? It's a platform, as we talked about, for transactions. Well, prepaid is still regulated like a gift card in multiple, provinces. And that's just a real challenge, because it's not allowing it to grow in a way that would be beneficial to end consumers. And then last is just payments modernization and the support for that process and for open banking as well. So we feel like if the Canadian government continues to take the right steps on those paths, and also doesn't take, a baseball bat to a gnat with respect to AML issues and with prepaid, then that's the most comfortable regulatory environment that we think will keep really strong players, good rails for us all to operate in, and be able, though, to grow the industry in a way that Canadian businesses and consumers can take advantage of more efficient, more innovative, cheaper financial services that are safe and secure. So I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that. Do we think regulation in Canada is hindering or helping the industry? It's different in every country.
Yeah, it is different. It is different in every country, certainly, right? Because it almost seems like prepaid sits somewhere in the middle between like a traditional debit and a gift card, right? And that's, to your point, Jennifer. As I get more familiar with each province and how they operate, some are leaning that it feels more like a gift card versus it feels more like a debit card and needs to be controlled. And somehow, how do we continue to carve out and help carve out that doesn't happen?
Right.
I mean, my personal take on this is, as we see the shift in use cases, and I'm thinking here in particular, kind of businesses, right? Kind of a lot of those, commercial deployments from a lot of the fintechs out there. I find these considerations are less of a hindrance, because you'll be doing a lot of that kind of KYC, AML anyways, right? When you're onboarding these customers. I feel like a lot of these regulations are very much designed for that kind of old school. You go into a store, you do it in person, right? Kind of check that ID, make sure it's not, versus kind of a more modern, digitally onboarded, very data-rich, data-heavy environment. So, is Canada any worse than other countries? I don't think so. I don't know if it's helping the industry per se. I don't necessarily think it's going to be that big a hindrance to the emergence of these newer digital first use cases, right? I think those kind of stumbling blocks, I'm not going to say they disappear. I mean, Jennifer, you can probably speak to that much, much better than I can. But I think, they become less of an issue in terms of just getting these products out there to market.
Yeah. So why do I think, I'd really love to address this head on, because I get asked this a lot, and I'd love to know what you guys think. Why are fintechs and now corporates as well turning to the prepaid platform? So maybe Kevin, you could start with that. I'd love to get Jan's thoughts as well, but why do they turn to prepaid as the first choice and to launch? And then I'd also like to know your thoughts on to grow when they're sort of heading to the next level as well.
Yeah, so at least what we're seeing when it comes to things like that, right? They need the quick hit, or they need that quick to market. They're looking for somebody to provide not only just that experience up front, but a turnkey solution that they're already integrated with a bank provider and a program, and how it's designed to work is already approved by the bank. And so they can come in, quickly spin something up. Maybe they're doing a sub bin range on it, or giving a portion of the bin for what they're trying to do. But they have a lot of the controls already in place that they can turn around and almost from a white label solution, turn around and provide somebody a white labeled solution to get them out the door. And then as they go along and they look at their processes and what's working or what we need to change, then I can work with my provider and morph and provide other opportunities or, value to what they're bringing.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Kevin. I mean, look, there's so much flexibility and nimbleness, right? I mean, it just enables plenty of clever applications. Basic technological requirements to implement this. It requires less capital. It's easy to market it as well. It's kind of a no fee, no maintenance sort of product. Low friction for customer adoption, and you really just kind of get the utility of credit and debit cards without that commitment necessarily of setting up an account, right? I mean, Jennifer, you sort of highlighted that the kid-focused banking services, I mean, it's very sort of accessible for those use cases. We talked about COVID, right? It's a perfect gateway for digital inclusion, and just really also accessible to any organization type. It's nonbanks in particular.
Yeah, Jan, that's interesting too when you talk about that, right? Because a lot of times interchange is key on that. And typically prepaid is a cash load, right? That's traditionally what it's considered. You can monetize from someone like that and putting a fee in that you don't want them to use the ATM, or you want to disincentivize them from going to an ATM to pull cash out on prepaid, right? It should be used for other things than trying to go get cash. I would have had cash for that or something else in a consumer type world, or even in a corporate card sense, right? In the corporate world with SMBs, I don't want my employee to be able to go get cash out. And if you do, right, you can restrict it, or if you're going to let them, then as part of the program, there's a fee that's associated with it that comes out. Of course, the ATM might also have this fee. So there's ways to kind of control and balance that and influence the behavior of the cardholder with those types of things in that experience.
One thing I think that's worth, sorry, just a quick pop in on this one. I think what's really interesting when you look at kind of some of these new developments and deployments, a lot of these newer fintechs, they're not mentioning that it's prepaid, right? Like that's not what they're leading with. They don't lead with this is a prepaid product that'll let you do X, Y, Z. They start with, this is a card-based product with all the bells and whistles. It'll do, expense management, virtual cards, instant issuance, added security, one-time card numbers, whatever it may be. And prepaid is kind of just very far down the list of kind of, features that they mentioned within, even though it's there. And I think that kind of speaks a lot to, it's that functionality, I think, that a lot of the fintechs are looking for, right? They're looking for what prepaid enables. They're not looking at so much from an old school perspective of, well, what's the funding mechanism? It's important, but that's more kind of the underlying mechanics. It's much more about, well, what's the user experience like, rather than the underlying, kind of mechanics of how that card may be funded.
It's a great point. Yeah, they're not leading out with this is a prepaid. Great point.
So here's a question that I have, and it leads into actually a question that Stephen has put in the chat here. So a lot of what I heard you say has to do with, fast, nimble, inexpensive, fast to market, all of that kind of great stuff. So do do then as companies grow, and we know that everyone's trying to create more of an ecosystem to keep everybody within their app. Like if you started out as a simple transaction, now you want to answer more banking or investing or, whatever savings like along with that. Does there come a time where, there's a perception that prepaid can't meet all of those needs and you need to move on to something more like a DDA account or something to that effect? And I think that fits in with what Stephen is saying here. And he's saying, the perceived benefits of, a Coho or a Stack or a Mogo is that user experience is better than a bank and the fees are lower, but is that a competitive, sustainable advantage? So I'm curious what you guys think about both of those questions.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Jennifer. I was actually kind of wondering about this as well, especially looking at the US space with some of those challenger banks sort of growing in size as well. And you kind of ask yourself, okay, at what point do they really kind of still look like that challenger bank and kind of how they started off, and at what point do they become really more and more similar to a traditional bank that's out there, right? With the nuances to those financial products, those accounts that you would be used to from those institutions as well, like overdraft, right? At what point do your customers demand credit cards? And then now you're really kind of thinking about a payment instrument that's a little bit more complex. Could you sort of stay on the prepaid rails? I'm sure. I just wonder, it might just be a factor of kind of the strategy that you're taking as an organization.
I think another way to look at it too from an experience is what drives someone to use their card. Obviously, that's what people want to have done. Can a prepaid in a world do a roundup and have some of that funds? If I go spend $5.95 somewhere, I'm going to have that rounded up as a total of $6, and then move 5 cents over into, maybe it's called my charitable account, or it's going to go to my play money account or something. But we're seeing more and more that there's this need people want to give back to the community or to their favorite charity or something. And rather than having to think about, I need to set 10% of the transaction aside, or I need to put some money aside, or I'm going to go into my account, as they're spending, right, they can have that money automatically moved. And then when that balance in another account builds up, they can make a transaction to their favorite charity or contribution, or move that money back onto their card and go down and spend with them, or do something different, right? There's different vehicles. And I think that's where, from a bank's perspective, and what these other incumbents are providing that are online, is that what else are you going to provide to me that I feel like I can get back to the community? That's another movement that we're seeing, is how do I give back to the community or the environment or whatever.
Just to add on to that, I think that's bang on, Kevin. It's kind of, there's that question of, I think, scalability, and that's really what it boils down to, right? So all these new players, right, your Cohos, your Stacks, your Mogos of the world, they benefit from being a greenfield site, right? These are new companies, they've got a new digital platform, they've got all the kind of funky bells and whistles in there to make things, kind of snazzy with a great customer experience. That's really going to depend on the fintech, right? Kind of on how they decide to expand. I think it's inevitable. They'll need to, if they really want to keep expanding with their customer base, offer a broader range of services. But there's no reason why they couldn't evolve that into various ways, whether that's some sort of savings account, whether they do branch out into other card products. There's definitely methods to do that. One thing that I think is worth interesting, if you look at all those companies, all of them are pretty clear. They market themselves as an alternative to a bank. Right? Like, that's very explicit in their marketing. We're not just a standard bank. We do things a bit differently. We're a better experience, and all those nice features. I think that remains very attractive to a lot of customers out there. And it really becomes, can they keep that usability, that great customer experience, with the range of greater functionality? What that functionality may be, I don't think there's any single silver bullet solution there, but there's definitely scope, I think, for further evolution and growth there.
I've got a question actually kind of on this topic, and here's something that I honestly don't know. I've kind of heard it discussed, that idea that prepaid could actually also be kind of an on-ramp, if you will, to a deposit account, right? So you capture that customer and then you kind of convert them with a more sort of involved onboarding process, or sort of another scenario where it's not too much of an either or, right? Where you've got the deposit account and then the prepaid almost acts as a surrogate account that sort of provides added security. Is that something that you see a lot in this space or sort of observed in this space? Is there kind of a trend around this, or is it really just something that's more on the fringes?
It's certainly in the US. Kevin, you can probably answer
Yeah,
that.
it's certainly there. And I think in the US at least, right, prepaid in some ways got a bad rap early on, that it was for the unbanked or underbanked, right? Those that didn't have access to a financial institution. But there are incumbents out there that are they're being creative. How do I capture somebody that may not be in the system, or how do I get them in there, right? Those could be migrants that are coming over, right? They don't know how the U.S. system works. How do I capture them and get them into the U.S. financial institution or into the financial system? But then, yes, you offer them a product, they prove themselves out, or right. And it goes back to, there's kind of another question right here around, fraud mitigation and anti-money laundering. It's how do we vet them to bring them on, and what kind of risk scores do I put around them to then, to your point, graduate them to the next? Is it a demand deposit account? Is it credit? Is it secured credit?
That's interesting.
And to answer that just really specifically, because I'm not sure, Ryan's background, but, prepaid, because it runs on the Visa and MasterCard rails, is subject to all the same fraud mitigation techniques that you would expect from the credit card rails. And there is all the levels of AML and KYC that have to go into it for these kind of reloadable products. So it's certainly not a shadow, banking product, or something that is, less secure, or the people using it are not subject to the same, level of regulatory compliance.
Jennifer, if I could come back to something that was talked about earlier, right? Why are the cohos and the mogos, why are they so nimble versus a traditional bank? A traditional bank is somewhat stuck with what they have in their ability, and they haven't been thinking outside the box. That's what's driving a lot of these fintechs to come through. Is the bank is looking for it. Look, it doesn't matter what industry or what country you're in. The bank is looking for deposits, and if there's another way that someone can bring deposits to the bank, that's great. Most banks don't. They'll set up, and this is more behind the scenes so that people understand how the banks operate. The banks will create several accounts related to a specific program. Let's maybe use Coho as an example. Coho's funds that are represented for all of their cardholders sit typically in one account with the bank. And then your processors like Galileos and Marquetas and Synapses, they all turn around and they are the subledger to the bank, and they're keeping track of where everybody's money is at, and then letting the bank know who's regulated, who's licensed to move money. Hey, bank, this is how money needs to move now. Here's all our information for what's happened in the day for the program. And I sometimes think people don't really understand what's going on behind the scenes, and why are companies like this able to move a little bit faster and be a little bit more nimble. In my opinion, it really has to do with the bank is looking for deposits, and if someone else can help bring those deposits in, they're happy, and they'll help support from that perspective.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. The other thing I would tell people, we think of Canada as a highly banked population, and that is true. However, there is data to show that about 10% of Canadians are, let's call them underbanked. Maybe they have a bank account, or they're not using it, or they live in a remote community where they don't really have access to their bank account that perhaps exists, or they don't because of that reason. And so this is a way of reaching everybody. So when I talked about the government use cases, we just feel like it makes a ton of sense, because you're not reaching everybody through a direct deposit kind of situation. But combine that with, the fact that, millennials or Gen Z or whatever you want to say, want to do things differently. They're digital natives. We all know that our online banking is not the same. If you've ever used a challenger bank's app and portal, it's just not the same thing. It's the traditional banks are taking something that existed over here and are trying to just put it in a mobile format. The user experience, as silly as it might sound, really just is so foreign to particularly people that are younger, that it just makes a lot more sense. I think we're done our time. So I do want to, there was one quick question about closed loop gift cards. I don't have data on that. Gilles might, but I don't know. I know there's been growth, but I don't know how that, I'm sorry.
We can take this offline. If I don't know what's the best way to do this, either message us, maybe find me on LinkedIn. You know, we're happy to kind of reach out that way.
Great. Yeah. Everybody knows on LinkedIn. The other thing I just want to close with, that if you're interested in this industry, I just want to again let you all know that in about 5 weeks, we are having an in-depth day on prepaid. If you go to cppo.ca and click on Prepaid Symposium, you can learn more, or just learn more about the organization, or find me. I'm happy to send you, anything I have, or answer any questions. But thank you, Kevin, Jan, and Giles, for coming today. That was a great session. You all are incredibly knowledgeable, and appreciate you joining us today. So I hope everyone has a great rest of the afternoon at the summit.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.